Good evening, everybody. I am so very happy to be teaching this class, Perplexing the Guide, reading the guide together at Emmanuel Synagogue in Oklahoma City. And I'm so glad that you came to spend 1 hour of your life with me on the Rambam. First, I have to introduce you to who is the Rambam, who is Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, who is a Jewish superstar. We're going to end on this note. There is a saying written on the man's purported grave. We don't know if he's really buried there. Tradition has him buried in Tiberias. That says, Mi Moshe ve'ad Moshe lo kam ke Moshe. From Moses to Moses, that is from Moses, our master, to Moses ben Maimon, there no one arose like Moses ben Maimon. So, and you might recognize from the Yigdal, lo kam be'Israel ke Moshe od. So, which is the 13 principles of our rabbi, of the matter of our study, put into liturgical use. You know what you made it if you make it into the Siddur. If you make it to the Siddur, your legacy is secure within the Jewish people. That is the text that Jews that deal with religious texts deal most often with. So the fact that he's in the Siddur should tell you a lot about it. So this is the way in which I want to structure this lecture. I want to explain about Sepharad first. Rabbi Moses ben Maimon we can't understand what he did and why he did it if we don't understand where he was born and when he was born. Like all the confluence of the happy coincidences, the providential streams that brought him to have the education to do what he could do, could only happen in the 12th century in Spain. And if you were part of the Jewish community in Spain, and how that affected his own Torah, how he was a migrant, he had to leave Spain in his teens and relocate to Egypt, where he spent the rest of his life. And this is something that with the Rambam, a lot of people like to do, which is take him apart. But really, this is a polymath of such breadth that if you don't take him one strand at a time, it's hard to digest the guy. We're going to talk about him as a scientist first. He was a doctor. He wrote many treatises on medicine, on astronomy. Then we're going to understand his role as a rabbi and community leader. And then finally, what's going to be what we're going to be busy with for the next 6 months, which is Maimonides the Philosopher. How does his thought what does his thought say, and how we can use it for the perplexities of our time. And that is actually the reason I want to study Maimonides, and I want to study him with you today. I think, if anything, these past 2 years have shown us the incredible reaches of science, the things that science can achieve. And I'm not just talking about the vaccines and the medical and the possibilities of us coming together to defeat this virus, but also, I don't know if you're following it, I'm very excited about the James Webb telescope, which was launched successfully on Christmas Eve, and it's now on its 30-day deployment. And this thing is about 8 times more powerful than the Hubble. So we are about to grapple with incredible cosmological revelations, and this is the man that has given us the plan. If we don't do this, if we don't engage the science of our time, if we don't think with our Jewish brains and our Jewish hearts how to interpret the science of our time, what the Maimonides said, and the reason he wrote the Guide of the Perplexed, is Judaism is going to become the property of the simple-minded, of those that are not engaging the world to the fullest of potential, which is how he saw scientific inquiry and also Torah inquiry. So I think his work is still very relevant, and it's going to be a guide for us today, 800 years after his death. And we're also going to talk, because he's been relevant throughout Jewish history, but it's always been interesting when the Rambam comes and starts affecting the conversation. So first, let's talk about Spain. Moses Maimonides was born in the year 1138 in Cordova, in the southern part of Spain, today Andalusia, which at the time was Muslim territory. Spain is a very interesting place. Like by Spain, I'm flies here. I mean Iberia. The Iberia Peninsula, both Portugal and Spain, are the land bridge between Africa and Europe. It was the first place to become a Roman province after it was settled by native indigenous tribes. It was settled by the Greeks, the Carthaginians. Rome came and established its first province, very successful Roman cities, Roman roads. And the reason that the Romans wanted it, and the reason that the Greek and the Carthaginians wanted this, was for two very good reasons that are going to be very important for the history of Spain, and actually almost also the history of the Rambam, which is Spain, like the Iberian Peninsula, is a agricultural powerhouse. It is on the same latitude as the Middle East, right? If you take the Iberian Peninsula and you just go east, you're going to hit Syria, the land of Israel. Therefore, the same crops grow in Spain that grow in the Middle East. But as you can see, the Iberian Peninsula is crisscrossed by many, many rivers, which the Middle East isn't. So if I am a Middle Eastern society, if I like olives and I like wine and I like silver and gold, and everybody loves silver and gold, I want to own Al-Andalus. I want to own Iberia, Hispania, because this place has it all. It's a blessed land, which is just on the right, a combination of wet and dry to produce all the food the Roman Empire needed for a while. Then later it was invaded by Germanic tribes, the Vandals, the Alans, eventually the Visigoth, that came all the way from Eastern Europe. They crossed the Roman Empire and they settled in Spain. And they created a Visigothic Christian kingdom. There were Jews in Hispania, in the Iberian Peninsula at this time, and the Visigoths did not have a great relationship with them. We're going to talk about the Jews of Hispania in 1 second. In 711, a very small group of shock troops crosses the Strait of Gibraltar, led by a guy named Tariq ibn Ziyad, who was a North African convert to Islam. And in 3 years, they conquered the entire peninsula. The Visigothic kingdoms were so weak, were so impoverished, were so disunited that very quickly the Muslims took over the entire peninsula, and it would take Christendom 8 centuries in reconquering this land, which is called the Reconquista, and it's going to shape the whole history for good and for bad of Spain, Portugal, and its Jews. And the Muslim kingdoms that were established in Hispania, in Iberia, were incredibly rich. They had the silver, they had the gold, they had all of the olives and the wine and the grain, and they could even rival people in the East, like Damascus and Syria and Iraq. And eventually that is what happened. In the 10th century, all of the Muslim lands of the Iberian Peninsula were unified in what was called the Caliphate of Cordova. Now, in Muslim politics, if you claim that you're the Caliph, that is claiming absolute authority over the Muslim world, right? This is something, it's a very big deal. And the fact that we have a guy in Spain, far away from Mecca, far away from Damascus, far away from Baghdad, saying, I am the Caliph, just shows the level of power that Al-Andalus had developed. These break down, and in the year 18, they break down into little kingdoms, into little Muslim kingdoms, the kingdom of Granada, the kingdom of Cordova, the kingdom of Toledo. And eventually this union sets the scene for 1085 for the Christians to capture Toledo. And that is a big wake-up call for for Muslim Al-Andalus. And what they do is that they invite the Almoravids, which are groups from the Maghreb, from Morocco, said, we need you to help us fight these guys. But the Almoravids were what we would call today Muslim fundamentalists. And the people that were in Spain were not Muslim fundamentalists. They had developed this culture of poetry and learning and libraries and water and incredible scientific advancement, which they did. It requires a tolerant, successful kingdom. And the Almoravids were not into that. They were more rigid in their approach to Islam. And this back and forth between fundamentalism and a more Spanish model, a more traditionally Iberian way of doing things, is the framework into which Maimonides is born. He is born in the city of Cordova, which is called, it was called by people who visited from Europe, it was called the ornament of the world. By the time Maimonides is born, Cordova is the biggest city in Europe, with 350,000 people. There is no city. Paris does not have 350,000 people. Paris certainly does not have night lights. They don't have surgery. They don't have libraries. They don't have academies. And this is because as the center of a very wealthy Muslim kingdom connected with Mecca and connected with the caravans and connected with Africa and also trading with France, because trade never stopped between the Arabs and the Christians in Iberia and then into with the greater European world. So this is a place that is independent. When Abdullah Rahman III says, I am the Caliph, I am no longer subject to the kings in Baghdad, he is showing his power. Says, like, you can't enforce your authority here. You be the Caliph in Baghdad, I'm going to be the Caliph here in Cordova. And he does this by doing what the Abbasids, which were the other dynasty that was ruling the Muslim worlds in Baghdad, which is, I'm going to show how rich I am by promoting knowledge, by translating the Greek, translating works from antiquity into Arabic, by funding madrasas, by building big buildings, showing wealth through culture. And it worked for him. His kingdom became enlightened, extremely successful, extremely rich, agricultural developments, mathematical developments. And because of this atmosphere of enlightenment, of classical learning, which in Spanish is called convivencia, which means living together, many Jews and Christians as well participated in a multicultural court and in a multicultural city. And we have here Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who is a very important Jew that I'm going to introduce you in the next slide, but he was pretty much the vizier of Abdullah Rahman III. We're gonna know that Maimonides actually also had this role. He was the guy in charge in a very political way. He was sent on missions. The reason why he was chosen to become the vizier and to help with diplomacy and policy was that he spoke Latin and that he spoke Spanish. We have a Jew in Muslim Spain who speaks Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and Spanish, and who is a doctor and a scientist and who can serve his king by going places and establishing connections. Eventually, this breaks out into little Taifa kingdoms, but those Taifa kingdoms are competing now within each other, like Saragossa is competing with Toledo, Toledo's competing with Cordoba, Cordoba's competing with Granada, and this time gave a lot of ambitious young Jews the chance to shine in little courts, as Hasdai ibn Shaprut had shown in his day. So we have this multicultural city with the texts from antiquity, a lot of money, and Jews participating fully, well, as best they could as tolerated minorities in cultural, commercial, philosophical exchanges. And in a family of judges, Moses ben Maimon is born. Now, the Jews of Al-Andalus, the Iberian Jews, and this today even survives into the descendants of these communities through Spain and Portugal, are extremely proud of their background. They're extremely proud of their of the past, of the great advancements that Sepharad has given, and we are completely right in being proud of these achievements. The Jews in Spain certainly saw themselves as very old exiles. They said, we are here since the time of Solomon. They called themselves the Exiles of Jerusalem, who live in Sepharad, who live in Spain. This date of being in Spain since King Solomon is a little exaggerated. We have archaeological evidence of Jews in the 3rd, 2nd century, in those Greek outposts, in those Carthaginian outposts. Remember, the Carthaginians are Phoenicians, so they're Semitic. We can understand ourselves, like when I speak in Spanish to Fafa speaks Portuguese, we can understand it. We could understand the Phoenicians, so there were certainly Jews in the Phoenician colonies and the Greek colonies. And then when it becomes a Roman province, Jewish communities start to be in Roman Spain. But then when Iberia becomes part of the entire Muslim world, something magical happens, which is now you have 95% of the Jews in the world living under one political unity. Jews before that had been living in different countries, like Jews were living under Visigothic Spain, some Jews lived in Italy, some Jews lived in the German, in the Germanic kingdoms of North Africa, or in the Byzantine Empire, or they lived in the Parthian Empire, in Iraq and Babylon. So Jews were living in different countries, but when the Muslims take over all that swath of land in North Africa, Iberia, and Mesopotamia, and then later the Byzantine Empire in Turkey, that's 95% of the Jews of the world. And all of a sudden, they can all speak the same language. Now, true, Jews did speak Hebrew. They did speak Hebrew. They didn't speak Hebrew. They read Hebrew, and they had ways of communicating, but now they are connected. You could send a letter from Cordova, and it would arrive in Baghdad 2-3 months later through the caravans, through the ships. So now we are in a highly connected Arabic-speaking community where Jews move freely. And since Spain is blooming, Jews also are coming with Arabic-speaking settlers, most of them Muslim, to settle the new frontier. And here is where you have this city of Cordova. You have Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who is the caliph's right-hand man, and he's a scientist, a vizier, a diplomat, a translator. If you've read the book of the Kuzari, in which there's this philosophical treatise explaining Judaism, defending Judaism, in which a king in what today is the Caspian Ukraine decides that he is going to convert to whoever can persuade him. And he has brought a philosopher and an imam and a priest, and none of them convince him. And then the rabbi, of course, gets to win, because there was indeed a Khazar kingdom in Eastern Europe in the 10th century. And Hasdai bin Shaprut even sent them letters. And we have the letters that he received explaining, there's Jews here in Spain as well. Let's be friends. Let's communicate. This is how Jews were serving their political country, like they were serving Cordova and they were serving Al-Andalus, by connecting with far distant Jewish communities and strengthening those bonds of trade and intellectual exchange. Poetry, philosophy, the Jews of Al-Andalus were the most cultured in a long, long time. There was a different kind of spiritual renaissance happening in northern France. That is where Rashi is coming from, the Tosafist school. But the other center of great cultural production was in Spain. And it was all under the aegis of this, in the beginning, extremely tolerant, or relatively tolerant regime, which got less and less tolerant. And then that's when golden ages crack and disappear. So in order to understand the Torah mindset of the Jews of Spain, you'd have to do a little bit of archaeology. You have to do a little bit of history. The most unified the Jews have ever been, the Jewish people have ever been in their entire history, was between the 7th and the 10th centuries of the Common Era. Why? After the collapse of the destruction of the temple, after the Roman conquests and the destructive wars, Jews were living in a diaspora. There were Jews living pretty much all through the Mediterranean basin and even down to Yemen, even down to Ethiopia. There were Jewish communities reaching Hindustan, but most of the Jews were concentrated in the Mediterranean basin. But they were all living, as I said, in different communities. And this might come as a shock, but they were not practicing the same kind of Judaism. The Jews that were living in Greece, that were living in Turkey, had a fairly Hellenized Greek-speaking Judaism. They were probably reading the Torah in Greek, right? They have incredible mosaics in their synagogues with depictions of the sun god. This was even in the land of Israel. If you go to several of the synagogues in the Galilee, you'll find exquisite Hellenistic art from the 3rd, 4th century, like that have like pictures of like Roman deities, as it were, on the floor of the synagogue. And as you find Judaism in the Atlas Mountain in Morocco, extremely different, very different. Every Jewish community was kind of like an isolated island, but that changes when the Muslim Caliph, the Caliphate, shifts and centers around Baghdad. When the Abbasids take over the Muslim world in the year 750, all roads lead to Baghdad. Baghdad did not exist. It was a city that the Abbasids did to glorify their conquest. And from there, everything, all the taxes, all the books were passing through Baghdad. Now, the Jews of Baghdad, the Jews of Babylon, had a thing. And they loved that thing. They loved it very deeply. And it was called the Babylonian Talmud. It was called the Babylonian Talmud. They have done it. It was their crowning achievement of almost 6 centuries of Babylonian scholarship. And the Jewish institutions were very, very much invested in it. And once the Jewish community of Baghdad becomes the main voice, once Baghdad becomes the most important city of the world, the Jews of Baghdad become the most important Jews in the world. And everybody wants to know about the Talmud. And everybody is looking for guidance from the Geonim of Babylonia. There were the 2 academies that compiled the Talmud. They were still open in the time of the Abbasids. And the heads of these academies were the authoritative interpreters of the Talmud. So every single Jewish community throughout the Mediterranean basin and Yemen and the Hindustan, how did they get religion? How did they communicate? They would send questions through the caravans and the ships, and it all converged in the academies of Baghdad. Of course, this all came at a price, right? You have to send a nice donation to the academies in Baghdad, and then they read your letter, and then they send you an answer, and they fold it, and wherever that letter stops along the caravans, it is copied by the Jewish community, and that is how Judaism became properly rabbinic. Before this period of time, before the splendor of Baghdad, each Jewish community was doing kind of their own thing. They had a shared biblical library, but we don't know until what extent rabbinic teachings were part of everyday Judaism. But it is during this period and the strength of the Geonim that most of the Jewish world becomes rabbinic. There's 2 great exceptions. One, the Jews of Ethiopia never received the Talmud, so they just kept doing their own thing. And the other thing, there was a counter balance. There was a counter Judaism, which was called Karaism. And there were Karaites, and the Karaite movement was incredibly successful, particularly in the Middle East. And the Karaites said, like, no, we are going to keep the Judaism of the Bible, of the Tanakh. We are not going to be adding the Talmud. And for a lot of medieval Jewish history, we did not know if rabbinic Judaism was going to win or Karaism was going to win. Even in the time of the Rambam, there were more Karaite Jews in Egypt than rabbinite Jews, like Jews that follow the rabbis. But as all good cities, Baghdad starts to collapse. The Abbasid Empire starts to collapse, And other Muslim kingdoms start sprouting up in North Africa, in Egypt, in Spain, in Morocco, in Tunisia. And the Jews of these communities start saying, like, why do we need to keep sending our money and our answers to Babylonia? And here is where the tale of the four captives comes in. I'm sorry, I have to be more mindful of the time. Once upon a time, in the year 978, there were four rabbis that were going out to the different Jewish communities. What were they doing? They were schnorring. They were asking for money for the yeshivas in Babylon, and they were captured by pirates, by Muslim pirates. And it was a fair, until very recently, it was a common practice for certain groups to kidnap Jews, and then Jewish communities would pay the ransom for them. So these different rabbis were ransomed by different communities, right? One rabbi was ransomed by the community in Egypt, and the rabbi said, well, I owe them so much, I need to go and serve them. And another rabbi was ransomed by the community in Kairouan, and he went to Kairouan. Another rabbi was ransomed in Bari. Bari was a city in Italy. Here is where the Talmud is going to enter the Ashkenazi world. The teachers of the teachers of the teachers of Rashi were all Italian. We're all learning Talmud in Bari. Bari was not, Italy did not exist. It was part of the Byzantine Empire. These were Greek-speaking cities in Italy that had contact with the East, that traded with the East, and therefore had caravans, and the caravans could bring copies of the Talmud, and it could bring copies of the Teshuvot of the Geonim. And Rabbinic Judaism really sets a hold on Ashkenaz is here, it's through Italy. And we have this tale of the four captives, which is kind of like the mythical explanation of why all of a sudden we have centers of Jewish learning flourishing all throughout the Mediterranean. And none was more shining than Spain. The rabbi in question is called Moses ben Hanoch, and he is brought, and he is, Hasdai ibn Shaprut recognizes that this is a man of great learning, and he makes them the chief rabbi of Cordova. He makes them the head of the yeshiva, and Torah is going to blossom in Spain, particularly in a town called Lucena. Lucena was a mostly Jewish city. It's about 30 miles south of Cordova. You can still visit today. The Juderia, the Jewish quarter of Lucena, is unfortunately not well preserved, but it was a huge center of learning. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi moves from Fez in Morocco to take leadership of the yeshiva. And Rabbi Alfasi has a fantastic idea. Everyone loves the Talmud, right? We've just come from 300 years of rah-rah Talmud. The Talmud is the way in which we see Judaism. But here is the big problem of the Talmud. The Talmud is hard. The Talmud is difficult. The Talmud is in Aramaic, which, yes, it was the lingua franca of Jews 1,000 years ago, but now Jews are speaking mostly Arabic. So it's in a language that we can't understand. At least if it were in Hebrew, people would understand, but no, it's in Aramaic. And also it's a very messy book. It has, like, the laws of tzitzit are found in, like, the tractate about flower offerings. Like, it's very hard to find something. So Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi does something brilliant, which is he takes the Talmud and he takes out all of the fluff, all of the stories, all of the legends, all of the midrash. I think he would call it fluff. I think the midrash is fantastic, but it creates the first attempt to say, you know what? Yes, we love the Talmud, but the Talmud is not a practical book, and we really need to know what to do, right? If the Talmud is going to guide our life, we need a book that can guide us. So Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi chops all of the non-legal stuff out of the Talmud, takes all of the variant opinions, and leaves just kind of like, this is what we do, this is what we follow. It creates, though, this notion of democracy. We are now living in a Jewish world where where most Jews are literate, certainly those living in big, not only literate, but often bilingual or trilingual. And what they're saying is, look, you're a busy person, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, whatever, but you want to be a good Jew. Here, I'm going to make it easy for you to be a good Jew, because we are not the yeshiva of Babylon. And actually the yeshivot of Babylonia, very soon after this explosion of Torah in the West, they close. The last Gaon was in 1050. Why? Because the people that today we would call the Iranians take over Baghdad and destroy it. So that yeshiva is gone, and now Torah lives in Spain and lives in North Africa and lives in Ashkenaz. This is where the Rambam gets his Torah. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi ordains Rabbi Yosef ibn Migash, who ordains Reb Maimon ben Yosef, who is the Maimonides father. So this is what is on his back. Maimonides is born in the biggest city in the biggest city in Europe, with the best libraries, with the best books. Jewishly, he is incredibly privileged. His father is a rabbi. He's one of the best, most learned men in the city, and he's about to inherit the world. But this is a map of Maimonides' life, and this is, I think, what makes him, yes, sometimes when you read him, he can sound a little full of himself. He knew how smart he was, and he was extremely smart. But this shows that this has given me a lot of, this map, this image has given me a lot of compassion for the guy. He's born in 1138 in Cordova. In 1148, he has to leave Cordova. Why? Because the Almohadim, another sect of fundamentalist Islam, is taking over Spain. And this time they say, you know what? I think we've let you Jews and Christians stay long enough. You either convert to Islam or you move. Now, most of the Jews moved, and they moved to northern Spain, which at the time was Christian. This is where we're going to get like all the nice rabbis from northern Spain. But the Ben Maimon family goes a different route. And here is the mounting consensus of scholarship is that the Ben Maimon family lived for a substantial amount of time as crypto-Muslims. That is, that they had to pretend that they were Muslim, they had to go to mosque, but, and he writes it in this beautiful book, which it's been translated. It's called the Epistle on Martyrdom. He says, everybody, like the Muslims know it, and they want us around and they don't care. This is something that the government is, it was not like the persecution that we're going to see in Spain in a couple of centuries, where they were like spying and actively trying to get compliance out of Jewish people. It was okay, you sign on the dotted line, whatever. It'll take a couple of generations. But apparently many families were practicing Islam openly and secretly observing Judaism, and not only observing Judaism, this is when the Rambam learns his Torah. So the Torah that the Rambam got from his father, which is learned from the time he is 3 to the time he is 20, is all given to him in Spain, half of that time probably pretending he is Muslim. But he's also, probably because he was officially Muslim, he had access to incredible scientific learning, medicine, astronomy, mathematics. The Rambam knew the Quran very well, and he brings it to bear in his legal writings. He knows this book. Eventually things get too hot in Spain, and they move to Fez, which is the core of the Almohadin movement. So this is probably not great for him. And from here is that we got this epistle on martyrdom. Apparently some rabbi that was not there to give them good advice, probably lived far away in New York or LA or somewhere where they don't know how things work in Oklahoma. So in Fez, said, oh, all those people who converted to Islam are no longer Jews. And not only are they no longer Jews, but if they do a mitzvah, if they try to pray in a synagogue, if they try to do a mitzvah in secret, that is a transgression. And we have a 25-year-old Rambam writing with the wonderful vibrancy of a young man saying, this guy's an idiot, and let me tell you why. And he says, we are experiencing this and this and this. And basically, he is giving his community heart. He's saying, don't trust this guy. We are here, try to get out. God sees your intention, which is going to be a lesson that Iberian Jews will have to take to heart in the next 800 years. Eventually, though, the family leaves. They leave Fez. on the 4th of April of 1665. And it's a 1-month trip. And it was so bad that the Rambam, till his dying day, on the 18th, on the anniversary of the 18th of April, he had a day of fasting. He did like a personal Yom Kippur. Like he was in a ship and they're all going to die and they were in the middle of a storm. He said, if God gets me out of this, I'm going to observe a fast day on this day. And he did to the end of his life. So it was not a pretty trip. They land in the Holy Land, which is 1165. It's in the hands of the French, of the Crusaders. They stay for a year in the Holy Land, and then they say, nope, hard pass. That the Crusaders were not friendly to Jewish settlement in the Holy Land. And in June of 1166, he reaches Fustat, which is the old city of Cairo. And there he stays till the end of his life. Now, Cairo is one of these rising Muslim cities, and it is also a war front because it's next to the Crusader kingdoms. In 4 years, the Crusaders are going to invade Cairo and burn it to the ground. The Rambam's father died around that time. We don't know if maybe he was killed by Crusaders. When the Crusaders they made a point of killing Jews. But here also is where you're going to have Saladin, which is the new king of Egypt, who is going to replace the dynasty in a couple of years, and he's going to take the Holy Land back for Islam. And his doctor is going to be a nice Jewish boy named Moses ben Maimon. And Musa ibn Maimon, the scientist, arrives in Fustat at the right time. This is a man who, when he was 20 years old, wrote a treatise on intercalation. Intercalation is when you decide as a Beit Din that the year has been too short and that you need to add another month of Adar. It's very hard. It's in rabbinic, in the Talmud, it's like, you should really leave people with like really good mathematical skill do that. And he writes this beautiful treatise of intercalation. He writes it in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic. That is he's writing Arabic using Hebrew letters, which is a book for Jews, but Jews like him who read Arabic. And he is showing a lot of promise mathematically and scientifically. When he is in Fes, probably pretending he's a Muslim, he studies medicine under Abu Bakr, the son of Ibn Zohar. Ibn Zohar was one of the most famous Arabic doctors. There was a great school of medicine in Morocco, the same place where Averroes, which is kind of like the Muslim Rambam. There was a guy also born in Cordova around the same time, and he did for Islam what the Rambam did for us. Fascinating character. But yes, he went to the best medical school in the world, which at that time was in Morocco. He writes a treatise on logic, which is called from Aristotle and Al-Farabi and all the Arab interpreters. And then he joins Dar al-Ilm. Dar al-Ilm was the University of Cairo, where he was there as a scholar and lecturer. People said, and they had this Jew teaching, and his name was Musa ibn Maimon. So as a young man, he is recognized for his brilliance. He is teaching in Muslim institutions. He's teaching medicine. He's learning medicine. This is a guy with a brilliant future as a scientist. His medical works, he took, at that time, the height of medical thought was the Roman Dr. Galen. And what he did is he took the entire Corpus Galenicus and he put it down in easy to memorize Arabic aphorisms, right? So young Jewish doctors and Muslim doctors could have all of the information that Galen did in easy to digest packages. And here's where we're going to see probably the thread that ties the Rambam together. And I hope we see this through reading the guide, and I hope you feel it. This guy really wants you to learn. He is an educator first and foremost. He wants, like, this is too hard. I'm going to teach you a better way of learning. And he's a great organizer. He knows about brevity. In his medical works, he privileges observation and experience over tradition. For example, he says, Um, the Talmud has some really interesting medical advice. And when he has to say, like, that's bonkers and that's been debunked by modern medicine, he doesn't say, but it's in the Talmud. No, he says, look, I've seen it, and this cure should be this. When the Saladin's son, who was quite a party boy, asks him for a masculine reconstitutive to get back his manliness, he writes his formula and says, look, yeah, I know I'm giving you wine, and I know that you're not supposed to drink wine because you're a Muslim, but I'm giving you the recipe. This is what's good. If you want this effect as a human, this is what you have to take. You deal with your own conscience, because this is forbidden for you. It's not forbidden for me. And also, and here is where I think we see the Rambam as the consummate scientist. All of his works that we have, and we have a lot because of the Cairo Geniza. Like, that is the synagogue that the Rambam didn't pray into. Like, there were 2 Rabbinite synagogues in Cairo, only 2. The Babylonian one, which is where the Rambam was affiliated with, and the Jerusalemite one, the one that got their the things from Israel. The Cairo Geniza is the one from Israel. So the Cairo Geniza kept a lot of his works. And we know what the Rambam's handwriting looks like. All of his works, whether it be of science, of Torah, or of philosophy, have many corrections in his own hand throughout his life. That commitment to correction and self-correction and improvement is clearly a scientific thread that runs through his entire personality. And here is, I think, a key moment of the Rambam's life that is not usually spoken about. He gets to Egypt in 1666. He joins this very successful university. He's teaching, he's writing, he's seeing patients. His father dies. And then in 1170, he is 32. His brother, his only brother, David, his younger brother, dies. His younger brother was a merchant. Cairo was the center of the Indian Ocean trade that brought gems and spices from India to cities in East Africa, like Zimbabwe and Dar es Salaam and all these little port cities. And eventually all of that made it to Europe through Egypt. And his ship sinks in the sea. And the Rambam says, I didn't get up for a year. He was suffering with chronic depression, wouldn't get out of his bed. His life was over. And he cries over his brother. And then in 1171, the thing that gets him out of his funk is that he becomes Rais al-Yahud. And here is where the scientist needs to become the rabbi. Now, he had incredible Torah learning. His father was an incredible scholar in his own right. Even Migash, like, he has a clear line of tradition from the Babylonian academies through Al-Fasi, through even Migash, through his father, through him. On his free time, while he was running around the world, he had already written a commentary on the Mishnah, on the entire thing, that included not only a exposition of the Mishnah in clear Arabic, and his notes are like, oh yeah, this plant that the Mishnah is calling here in Aramaic, we call it in Arabic, blah, blah, blah. So he is one of the great sources for, like, botany in the Mishnah and zoology in the Mishnah. But even then, as a young scholar, he's interested in the big picture. And how do we mesh Torah with our lives, with what we know? In his introduction to the 10th parak of Sanhedrin, of his commentary on Sanhedrin, he writes us eschatology. That's where we get the 13 principles of the Rambam, right? That we later, Yigdal Elohim, that's from that. It's like, what should a Jew believe? And he comes up with 13 ideas. A lot of them already highly philosophical. Today, we thought, oh, God doesn't have a body. That's simple. It was not simple in his day. It was not like, this is probably one of the few philosophical fights that the Rambam won. That is, most Jews, old Jews, I would say, today believe that God has no body. In the time of the Rambam, that number was not 0. It was actually most of the Jewish people believed in the corporeality of God. And it's one of his few victories. His introduction to Pirkei Avot is called the Shmona Perakim, as one of the key works of Musar. It's Aristotelian ethics meshed with Judaism. He writes the letter of persecution, saying to his fellow Jews that were in crypto Islam, like, don't give up. But all of a sudden, he's Rais al Yahud. Rais al Yahud is, you are in charge of the Jews of this kingdom. You are the chief rabbi, which probably he got because he was a very well-connected man. He was teaching in a university. He was close to the people, close to the Sultan and then the Caliph, and he throws himself in community service and starts corresponding with the entirety of the Jewish people. And he realizes that, Houston, we have a problem. That thing that his father's teacher noticed was getting worse, is that people were like ignorant. The Jews didn't know how to Jew. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have Sefaria. Most Jewish communities are like several camel days away from the next Jewish community. We really need to know what to do. And he puts his mind to it and generates probably the finest legal code that we have, which is called the Mishna Torah. Mishna Torah means literally the second Torah. Mishna Torah is a rabbinic name for Deuteronomy. Deuteros nomos means the second Torah, the second part of the Torah. It's composed over 9 years. And in the beginning, in his introduction, which is really worth to read, the introduction to the Mishna Torah is very short, but it's really worth to read. He explains, he says, Moses got the Torah in Sinai, and here is the entire chain of tradition that passed to the prophets, from the prophets to the rabbis, and from the rabbis to the Geonim, and from the Geonim to me. He says, then there's two kinds of Jewish books. There is a Perush. A Perush is an interpretation, which is in which we try to clarify a text that already exists. And he says, most Jewish work is Perush. We're interpreting the Torah, we're interpreting the Talmud. He wrote an entire interpretation of the Mishnah. He is well acquainted with that. It says, but in times of crisis, and he really recognized the crisis in his time, he says, we need a new way of doing things. We need a chibur, we need a composition in which everything gets reorganized so people can remember, so people don't forget. Now, there are many legends that the Rambam certainly clearly believes that he is a descendant, a direct descendant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who composed the Mishnah. He says that's what Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi did in the year 200 of the Common Era. He had all of this oral Torah, and he said, we're going to lose it. I need to write it down, and I need to organize it. And what he says is, we're going to lose it, and I need to reorganize it. And then he does something that no one else has ever done. He's taken all the rabbinic sources, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Bavli, the Rishalmi, all of the Midrashim, everything he had, like all of the rabbinic corpus. And then he creates an easy to follow guide that has all 613 mitzvot, both the ones that we observe now and the ones that we don't observe ever, like the things that have in many ways that we can't follow today, and the things that we will follow if there's a temple. There's like laws about how do you do sacrifices? How do you build the temple? No other code in Jewish history has attempted that. And once it's written, like the Mishna Torah of the Rambam, it also gives it a holistic framing. It starts with a book about physics and philosophy, and it gives you ethics, and it gives you metaphysics. And most importantly, it's written in the most beautiful, clean Hebrew, and it's all organized in books. The laws of tefillin, boom. The laws of the Shema, boom. The laws of lending on interest, boom. Here they are, organized in chapter and little bullet points in perfect Hebrew. And because he's Rais al Yahud, of course, it goes everywhere, and it changes the way the Jewish world worked. Now, he was aware of that. And I want you to read this, although we're running short of think I'm going to have to take 5 minutes from Minyan from Rabbi. This is how he ends his introduction. Therefore, Havai, he says, everything is going terrible. The Jews are spread and we don't have Torah and people don't know what to do. I, Moses, son of Maimon of Spain, girded up my loins and supporting myself upon the rock, blessed be he, made a comprehensive study of all those books and minded to construct out of these a clear summary of the subject, right? The Talmud gives you competing, like gives you 5 opinions for everything. Like, no, this is clear. This is what you need to do. Of what is forbidden and permitted, defiled or clean with the other laws of the Torah. The whole scope in pure language and concise style, so that the oral Torah be entirely methodical in the mouth of everybody. And here's the zinger. Without query and without repartee, without the contentious, thus of one of such another, but clear text, cohesive, correct, in harmony with the law which is defined, out of all these existing compilations and commentaries from the days of our holy master, that's Moses, till now. So all the laws be open to young and old, whether they be laws concerning each and every commandment, like purely halachic matters, or whether they be laws concerning matters instituted by scholars and prophets. That's also theology, ethics, eschatology. The main object of the matter being that no man shall have a need for any other compilation in the world, for any law of the laws of Israel. Therefore have I named this compilation Mishna Torah, that is, the second Torah. For when one studies Holy Writ first and thereafter reads this work, he obtains therefrom a complete knowledge of the oral Torah, having no need to read any other book in between them. So you have your Tanakh and you have the Mishna Torah, and if you just want to know what to do, those are the only 2 books you need. This is what he's saying, but which of course sounds a little big, but look at what I have bolded. The world of the Babylonian academies was a world of privilege and rabbinic obscurity. The rabbis in the 10th century, the rabbis before the Rambam, particularly the rabbis in Babylonia, were making business out of being obscure, of making the Torah hard, of making the Torah abstruse, of engaging in what later would be called pilpul, which is I'm taking this rabbinic text and twisting it and bending it into a pretzel, which is great if you benefit from it. But if you're a poor like Jew that is working hard for the money, you need to know what to do. And this democratization of halakha put the Jewish world upside down, because nothing like this ever existed. And the Rambam started getting attacked immediately. Like, well, that's not the way we've done things, and you don't have the authority, and you're not the Gaon. But he believed in education. He believed in people. He said, you know what? I want you to be able to live as a Jew and thrive as a Jew and have enough time to go study math and study physics and like write poetry and live your life without learning Torah becoming the end all be all of your existence, without it giving you like concrete options. And this is a very stark difference between traditional Sephardic learning, which tends to focus on conduct. It tends to focus on what's the law, while in Northern Europe, they were more concerned because Jews had less control about like what they got to do. They lived in circumstances that were far more oppressive. It's more about like, what does the text say? And like kind of creating these incredibly complex matrices of meaning, which is like the Tosafist and by how Rashi reads the Torah. But the Rambam, again, being a rabbi and a scientist, he wants you to know what to do. Right? This is not a philosopher sitting in a cafe, sitting espresso. He's a guy that has real serious responsibility. He's in charge of all the Jews of Egypt and his patients and his students. And he says, you know what? You need help. You need clear information. Then we get to Maimonides the Philosopher. And I think this was the area of his life that I think he's most remembered, of course, certainly outside of the Jewish world. But I think he had a lot of problems with this aspect of himself. The Rambam clearly believed in science. He was a scientist. Certain parts of his Mishna Torah are extremely philosophical. He makes no excuse about it. But when he writes the Guide to the Perplexed later, as he is older, and this is actually his handwriting. You see this thing is the first page of the Guide to the Perplexed in Maimonides' own handwriting from the Geniza. He writes it as a letter, as a series of letters to his student, Joseph ben Yehuda ibn Shimon, who was another Spanish Jew who had also converted to Islam, who was a young mind, was good in astronomy, was good in math, he was reading Aristotle, and he was perplexed. He said, well, the Torah is telling me this, and I really want to believe in the Torah, and I really want to be a good Jew, and I really want to please God. But on the other hand, science and secular culture and Aristotle are telling me this, and I can't square it. I'm torn. And that is the perplexity that he is addressing in the Guide of the Perplexed. He is guiding Joseph ben Yehuda ibn Shimon about these thorny issues and saying, how can a Jew be a believing, practicing Jew, true to the Torah, while at the same time being a true person of their age, conversant in the science, benefiting from the science, engage with the world without having this split heart, which is, I think, a very good Jewish question for today, even if we don't like the answers that Maimonides is going to give us. And look, these answers are Aristotle. So this is old. Some of this stuff is no longer working, but I really want to focus on his process. How did he sieve through Torah and science to find kind of like that middle path that he advocated in ethics? In ethics, Maimonides said you should always go for the middle path, the middle road. Virtue is always the middle between two extremes, which he gets straight from Aristotle, and he does not hide it. And I think he tries to do something very similar in his philosophy. It's an encoded book. He says, you're going to have to work at it. And this is why we're going to dedicate an entire month to really combing the preface and the introduction and the first couple of chapters, because there's a lot to unpack there. In 1200, just 4 years before he dies, it's translated into Hebrew. And that's when trouble starts. Because as when he wrote it in Judeo-Arabic, and you see here it's written, Al-Talmid al-Zir'ab Yosef ben Rabbi Yehuda. This is written in Judeo-Arabic. Once it's translated into Hebrew, it starts to reach communities that did not have Aristotle translated, that were not used to these level of philosophical meditations about, for example, the non-corporeality of God. And we're going to see that people lost it. The God of the Perplexed. It's a vademecum. It's really not an organized book. And I think it feels to me that it bothered him. It's like, I just have so many questions that I'm putting here and trying to guide you through them, but it doesn't feel as organized as the Mishna Torah. He starts with philosophy of language. How should we read things in the Torah that say the throne of God, the hand of God, the head of God? People in certain places were taking that literally. So like God is a jolly cosmic giant. And there were like books called the Shiur Koma, in which they measure like, this is how big God's foot is, and this is how big his beard is, because of course God is male. This is how big his bris is. Like it's very graphic. Some people believe them. The Rambam is saying no. There are a lot of anthropomorphisms in the Torah. We have to read them different. He tries to, like, how can we even talk about God, right? Is God good in the same way that like a knife is good or a person is good? Like we seem to talk about good, like, but like what, when we say that God is good or just or fair, can we really apply the same measure to this than to the other? Why is there evil in the world? What's the nature of prophecy? Why are there any prophets anymore? He has to, the Bible's full of prophets. And then the rabbis say, yeah, when we came along, prophecy kind of died out. He has to explain why. He has to explain what's going to happen at the end of it all. Very interesting ideas about like the end of history. He spends about 30% giving solid rationale for the mitzvot. He says, the Torah cannot give you something irrational. And finally, he closes with some very confusing chapters that tend to point to a little bit of mysticism. So this is what we're getting into. But let's go into this knowing that there is definitely the smell of heresy around all of this. And it starts not even when the Rambam is dead. When the Mishna Torah is published, the book reaches France, and Rabbi Avraham ben David of Poskiers, which in the Ashkenazi world is called the Ravid, very respected rabbi. He's one of the fathers of Kabbalah. Before Kabbalah became public, he was one of the practitioners of Kabbalah, and he writes scathing attacks against Maimonides. He even writes an entire book called Hasagot HaRavid, which means like the complaints of the Ravid, in which he takes the entire Torah and like goes point by point, the Rambam, like wrong, wrong, wrong. How can you say that God doesn't have a body? Many better people than you think that God has a body and you're an idiot, like really harsh language. In 1991, the chief rabbi of Baghdad says, you don't believe that the dead come back from the grave. You are a heretic. And when the guide is translated into Hebrew, all of this just explodes. And it explodes in a very interesting place in the world, which is Provence. Provence is southern France, the part of France that has the water, like Montpellier and like Marseille and all of that part. That part is where the Inquisition is born in 1209. 5 years after the Rambam dies, the Inquisition begins not to persecute Jews, as they later would in Iberia, but to persecute the Albigensians. These are the Cathars. They were a dualistic Christian sect that took southern France by storm, and they needed people to persecute us, so they created the Inquisition. And the Jews of Provence that were caught between France and Spain, all of these Spanish scholars coming with Aristotle and Plato and Arabic and science and math, and we have from the north a trickle down of Kabbalah and like the Tosafot, like it's two Jewish worlds crashing in the middle. Provence was very rich. Jews settled there like it was the bridge to the rich Spanish Muslim communities. And there was a division. This was kind of like bleeding Kansas during the Civil War. You have the people that said Provence is going to be Maimonides territory. We're going to be rationalists. We're going to be Spanish. We're going to like preserve the Arabic texts and science, and we're going to do this exercise. And there were other folks that were saying like, no, we have to go in the orbit of France. We have to go into Kabbalah and mysticism. There was this group of extreme pietists in Ashkenaz that would do like, they would take like cold baths in the winter to defeat the Yetzer Hara. So there were mysticism versus rationalism. And in 1230, three rabbis, Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham, David ben Shaul, and Jonah Gerondi, and all of these guys are famous-ish. Like they've written like Jonah Gerondi has written a very Sharei Tshuva. They all try to convince the Provençal rabbis to ban studying the Rambam. You can't, this is leading our youth to heresy. This is leading our youth to science. We can't allow it. The rabbis of Provence say, nope, we don't want to get, we can't. It's the Rambam. Like he wrote the Mishna Torah. He's a big deal. He's a very respected rabbi. How can you ban him? So then they go to France. And in France, that they didn't know the Rambam as well, they banned him. And a war starts. And by a war, I mean there were actual people killed. Synagogues would go against other synagogues. Oh, you're a Rambam community. Oh, you're a heretic. And there were fights. Rabbis were sent on missions to try to get support from this rabbi and the other rabbi. And for 2 years, the Jewish world was on the brink of collapse, certainly in Provence. And then in 1232, after the northern rabbis banned the guide, but completely unconnected, some local guys in Montpellier take a copy of the book. They show it to the Inquisition, and the Inquisition goes, "Ooh, it smells like heresy," and they burn it. And that stops everyone fighting. Not only that, 8 years later, in Paris, the Talmud was burnt. And anti-Semitism in France starts to accelerate. And a lot of the people involved said like, oh, it's a punishment for us trying to ban the rabbi. In 1280, in Leon, in Spain, the Zohar is published. And the Zohar is published in many ways to counterbalance what was seen as the Rambam is taking over the intellectual world of the Jews. They're becoming too scientific. They're reading Aristotle. They're not believing in the God of in the real God. And this is where a lot of the friction between ultra-Orthodoxy and not ultra-Orthodoxy stem. There's the same fights we're still having 7 centuries later, start with the Maimonidean controversy. So very quickly, what is his legacy? We have like this man is so dizzyingly brilliant, and he had so many legacies. His family, his only son, and his descendants became Judeo-Sufis. His son inherited his title as the Nagid, as the head of the Egyptian Jewish community, and he started mystical, rational circles in tune with Sufism, which is Islamic mysticism, but they remained Jews. In the religious world, he is known as Hanesher Hagadol, the great eagle, right? His Mishna Torah is studied all over the world, but at the same time, there's a lot of ambivalence. In the century after his death, there were some very interesting books written. Some were saying, no, the Rambam couldn't have written this. It's all a forgery. Other people said, no, he did write it, but like before his death, he repented and he said, no, I'm becoming a Kabbalist. And then they wrote Kabbalistic books authored by Maimonides. Towards the end of the 13th century, Abraham Avulafia, one of the great Kabbalists, does a Kabbalistic interpretation of the God of the Perplexing, saying like, no, you guys are reading the book all wrong. He is really talking about something that the Rambam is not talking about. So the world has not, like the Jewish world is still in love, enthronged, trapped, and inspired by this man. That 8 centuries later, we're still talking about it. People saying, oh, the God of the Perplexing is a forgery. And then when modernity comes along and the Enlightenment, a lot of the founding fathers of Reform and conservative Judaism and like critical study of Judaism say like, he is our ancestor. He dared to look at the Torah through the lens of science and reason. Solomon Maimon, Mendelssohn, all of the great Jewish neo-Kantians saw Maimonides as a predecessor, which is the point. It's Maimonides, right? If you are ultra-Orthodox, you think that he was an ultra-Orthodox rabbi. If you're a Reformed Jew, you think that Maimonides was a Reformed Jew. And what I'm trying to help us all achieve in this time is for us to find our Maimonides, right? For each to find your Maimonides. I have my Maimonides, you'll get your Maimonides, and then we'll build our Maimonides and see how he guides us in the necessary work of making this fit, making Torah and our modern lives not at odds with each other. And with 10 minutes too much, I am going to stop the recording.